Oh, you're on.
Hello. This is Freightonomics. I'm Anthony Smith, lead economist here at FreightWaves. I'm alongside Zach Strickland, Director of Freight Market Intelligence.
And fresh off the phone.
Fresh off the phone, busy man. Also, if you know, you know, the Sultan of Sonar. Zach, we have a cool little, look at this graphic we got here. We got the Freightonomics graphic right behind us.
In case you didn't know what show you were watching.
This is Freightonomics.
If you're watching on FreightWaves Live, or FreightWavesTV.com. This is Freightonomics, where we like to combine the freight market and the overall macroeconomic environment, which is, of course, involves the global supply chains and everything in them. So there's a lot of stuff to talk about all the time because we're talking about the global situation, which is still as chaotic as it was 2 years ago.
It is chaotic, but before we jump into that, of course, thank you all for tuning in. I'm going to be looking down at my laptop from time to time. I'm not being rude. I'm going to be monitoring LinkedIn. So if you're watching, if you're streaming on LinkedIn and you're not getting a part of the full experience, it hurts my heart that you're not watching on tv.freightwaves.com to get the full experience. But if you're there, chat, leave a little question, comment, never get involved in the show if you happen to be watching live at 12 noon Eastern Standard Time. Also, gotta mention, we have this little thing coming up. Just kidding, it's a big thing. It's gonna be our first live event in 2 years. It's gonna be in Northwest Arkansas. Get your tickets now. We have March Madness tickets, only $12.95. This is only gonna be limited to the first 100 tickets sold, so get on it. It's gonna be May 9th through the 10th, and Northwest Arkansas, as I mentioned, at the Rogers Convention Center. You can register for this at live.freightwaves.com. Of course, you can see this event and all of our other virtual events as well, but this is one, Zach, that I am excited for.
Well, we haven't had a live event in a few years now.
Yeah.
Thank you, COVID. And if you haven't been to one of our events yet, this is, I mean,
you're in for a treat.
It's not your standard company retreat type event. There's a lot more to it than just that. We try to make it as entertaining and as informative as possible. I will be there, more than likely. Will you be there, Anthony?
I'll be around. I'll be there.
I'm sure you will.
I think I'm obligated. I have to be there.
Yeah. So a lot of informational exchanges going on, as well as networking availability. It's probably one of the most single attended events, or it used to be, back in, before the pandemic in the transportation sector. So definitely get your tickets for that. Now, moving on, Anthony.
Yes.
I was really proud of myself for today's title.
You did come up with that one.
It came to me, conflicted messages. Look at all that, just soaking in the double entendre there. Because we're talking about global supply chains being, really sending us some mixed signals.
Right.
We've got some data. You can have a lot of information, and some of it's going to point you in one direction, and sometimes you're going to have information that tells you something totally different, and it's going to be measuring the similar item. You talked about it this morning on Freightonomics, or FreightWaves Now, where we had some employment data that kind of suggested, similar situation, but a little bit of differing directionality to it. And we're seeing that across the global supply chains right now. We've got, in one hand, we have like tender rejections coming down, we got rates going up. They measure similar things, but you have to think it through a little bit to kind of discern that. And we're gonna break that down, as well as what's going on with the Ukrainian conflict over there with Russia and Putin, of course, trying to continue this chaos that we've been living in the modern society.
That's right. You say, even though it's all the way over there in Eastern Europe, it's making its waves.
Yeah, and
waves to the U.S.
One thing that has kind of come back around, and I want to give one quick meme here because it's been hard to come by memes lately. This one kind of hits. Putin to the people of Russia. In terms of money, we have no money. It's great.
Is this from one of those, is this a Pixar movie?
Despicable Me. How do you not know this?
Never seen it.
Oh my gosh.
But it's funny though.
Yes. I mean, the economic impacts of what Putin has decided to do here, especially to his country, are tremendous. I mean, with all the sanctions, we're going to break down some of the sanctions and what they mean for us here, because we're all connected. I mean, the fact is that Russia has been part of the global community. We've kind of been in, saying like, oh, you guys are cool now for the last couple of decades, 30 years really. That relationship has actually kind of been going okay. Right. I wrote a chart of the week about, I was actually surprised to see the import volumes from Russia to the United States, not huge, less than 1% of the total, but they were up quite significantly year over year just last year. So this is a disruptive event.
So which way are you talking? Russia importing U.S. goods or U.S. importing Russian goods?
U.S. importing Russian goods.
Gotcha.
And, we do have a lot of exposure to them upstream. Mm-hmm. We have commodities. Obviously, Russia does supply a lot of that raw materials, palladium, nickel, aluminum, one of the biggest exporters of aluminum in the world. Oil, of course, a big thing. But it's not just about directly to the United States. It's to the subsequent other markets, if you will, some other countries. China, for instance, of course, huge trading partner with Russia. But then, of course, all those European countries, they thought they were buds. Yeah. Not so much anymore. But yeah, this meme to me kind of spoke real loudly because it just indicates that this is probably not going to be a very long standing situation, hopefully not at least, in terms of escalation and whatnot, because economically speaking, it can't sustain.
It can't sustain, and I think this is, of course, one of the things we're going to get into a little bit later, but when you look at, I think the term being positioned is Putin's war chest. I mean, he was anticipating sanctions being put in place. This wasn't a surprise to him or, the Russian government there. They were anticipating this, or ready for this. So they built up a war chest of billions, I think over $600 billion worth of currency and commodities, and so they were ready for this. But they did not anticipate it hitting the way it did. I mean, of course, the stock market has been stopped. I think it's not going to be starting up until at least March 5th, but it's probably going to get pushed back even further. I wouldn't be surprised. The ruble has just been completely crashed. It's tanked. It's destroyed. You're looking at positions that some countries have taken really in a large part throughout the world. Lines have kind of been drawn in the sand and sanctions have been put in place, and really that war chest is really looking rather weak. So this wasn't a surprise to them, but I think to the extent they weren't really prepped for that.
Yeah, that's a great point, is that they were prepared for this. They knew they weren't just going to walk in there and everybody's going to be like, oh, that's cool. Yeah. But yeah, the fact that BP is pulling out, and things to that nature that are so extreme. I mean, we even had Switzerland, the neutrality.
Someone that you never hear from taking sides.
So that being said, let's go into news and nomics and break down some of this stuff. If you aren't looking at freightwaves.com, we are recapping every day anything remotely related to the conflict over there. John Kingston, of course, responsible for kind of reviewing and writing some of the various places that we're seeing these impacts. And of course, he is our oil market expert to a T. He's got decades of experience in covering the oil commodities markets and things like that at S&P Global. So. His article here, Russia-Ukraine roundup, another day of surging oil prices. The one big takeaway that I got from this article is that the futures, the settlement price for futures of diesel in April settled at $3.49 a gallon, an increase of 34.36 cents a gallon, or 10.9%. The outright increase is believed to be the highest one-day move in the history of the contract. That is some strong wording from our oil expert.
Is it 10.9%?
Yeah, 10.9% increase.
Yikes. Yeah, that is a substantial move there. And I know we had John Kingston on, I think, earlier in the week on Freight Waves Now, and he really broke down a lot of the situations that we were seeing there. One of the big things that kind of popped in my mind is, of course, the positioning of oil. So we'll see the effects really kind of pour out from this, but I think one of the things that I think he mentioned Iran potentially having some looser sanctions or some lifting from them to kind of fill some of the void that we're going to be getting. And that's an interesting, takeaway, because I wasn't sure if they have a relationship with Russia and if that's going to kind of, I don't know if, okay, hey, I know you're not seeing eye to eye with the rest of the world, but do you mind if I just kind of, give them a little bit of oil? I don't know if that causes a rift at all in that relationship.
I don't know that they're super tight anymore. I know India, China, and Syria, there was only a handful of countries that were supporting the Russians outright. Even, China didn't necessarily give them their full-on support, but they're not necessarily sanctioning anything. They're not changing their relationship status. They're just saying, hey, we don't support the war, but we're going to continue business as normal. Type situation. So economically speaking, they're really not a factor here in terms of sanctions and stuff like that.
Gotcha.
But it is interesting to see this. They're obviously, Russia's heavily outnumbered. I would argue that if it weren't for China's just presence in general, they would have already been slapped back. Because you just don't want to escalate the situation beyond. And I believe that's probably the right move. We don't want to see World War III happen in our lifetime, for sure. So one of the takeaways, too, from this oil situation. Now, not a lot of people think about oil directly, and it's weird because it's a huge percentage of the overall transportation cost and obviously has a big impact on global supply chains. I want to pull up this graphic here to just show you how, it's going to be the van contract graphic that we're showing, where I have the Department of Energy's average price of diesel fuel. Then we have the contract rate per mile for van, truckload, and we have the spot rate in yellow for spot freight in truckload. You see the oil price in green, or the diesel price, I should say, in green, up 35% year over year. The spot rate, 8% year over year. Now that 8% number includes the average price, or the fuel surcharges, if you will, or fuel costs. They're not always separated out in the spot market. Contracted freight typically has a fuel surcharge involved in it. So when that number increases like that, there's two takeaways here for anybody involved in trucking.
Okay.
One of the takeaways is cost inflation. That's the obvious one. That's straight over the top, coming right at you. Those spot rates, obviously, and Mike Vincent and I were talking about this the other morning, that spot rate obviously has enough buffer in it to absorb the inflation in the diesel price. So I'm estimating diesel cost to be roughly 16 to 20% of that figure that you see right there.
Gotcha.
The fact that those rates are coming down, they've been falling since the, I guess January-ish, mid to late January, when the Omicron variant was really peaking. My takeaway here is that there's been enough market buffering on the spot rate, but you can't see, it's masking that inflationary pressure on the cost side. So we can't see driver wages increasing in this number. We can't see fuel price impact in this number. But what you can see in the van contract rate here, that is a pure line haul cost. That does not include fuel, does not include any surcharges. So you can see also, not only are diesel prices increasing, which is a percentage upcharge and a cost that typically gets passed along to the customer, line haul rates are also going up. So your base transportation cost for trucking are going up, your diesel prices are going up. That spot rate number is going to hit a floor, and it's probably going to be higher than what it was a year ago.
Gotcha.
So anybody in the market, our floor for this rate to fall in the future is dramatically, it's growing quickly.
Yeah.
So don't expect a huge amount of contraction here in the future.
That's an interesting one, because not to expect that huge amount of contraction in the future, because that might be one of the areas that you're going to be looking for first. And so that's a great takeaway there, Zach. I'm over here looking at this chart because I'm like, that is a good comparison that you have up here. We're looking at that breakout here.
I might make a chart of the week out of it. Who knows? To dive into it a little bit further. That's good.
So if you haven't checked out Zach's weekly chart of the week, as the name would kind of infer, they're amazing and has a great following there.
They're very statistically driven there. Definitely don't look for a lot of stories, but you can certainly, if you're into the information itself, I dive into it a little deeper on those. So the next news-anomic story of the day that I have picked out here, Lorianne LaRocca.
She laid it out.
Just breaks it down. So anybody out there thinking, supply chains are getting better, we're starting to see some signs of improvement, which we are. We are seeing some small incremental signs. We just talked about spot rates coming down, but you saw those contract rates going up.
Yeah.
Another conflicted message there.
Yeah.
Spot rates are negotiated daily. Contract rates are negotiated for longer term cycles. So you're like I said, those day to day there comes a premium when you're negotiating on the spot in the transactional environment because it's not consistent. So there's going to be a little bit more of a market cost in there. Those contracts, very stable compared to the spot market. So the fact that those are moving in two different directions, not entirely unusual.
Yeah.
But Lorianne LaRocca sits here saying, okay, we are seeing some signs of things getting better, and she's mainly talking about the maritime shipping side of things. But she points out that after 2 years of logistics hell, her words, the world wants to believe things are getting better, yet these declarations are just empty prophecies. Talk about brooding, setting the table. New Project 44 intelligence quantified a whopping 23.35% drop in TEU capacity year over year in January. So the big takeaway here is that it's not necessarily because ships are being pulled off. It's because of all the congestion and delays around the ports, the COVID restrictions, labor shortages, and drayage issues. And she lines all these out in this article.
Yeah.
I mean, breaks it down thoroughly.
Yeah, I mean, the article, that one of the areas I really loved was the ship delays and how that's also increasing. So if you were to see some easing with a grain of salt, those ship delays are building up. And you mentioned in, I think the carrier update, one of them this morning, that there's still more goods coming in. You know, that 30 to 45 day outlook is still ramping up. And if you still see more goods coming in, more flows, more volumes, and on top of that, you're seeing more delays, there's not really all that much easing or that much improving as some of the other data sets that you might be looking at or looking to would suggest.
Yeah, I mean, it's, you don't think about it because you just think, okay, well, think about a slow-moving system here, like with the containers moving, if they're spending 13 days more on the water, moving from China to North America's West Coast, which was the case in December and January, than average, because of these delays, that's time that it's not being spent clearing out the backlog of orders, one of your favorite numbers.
Yeah.
And it says, despite factories in China getting back up and running post-Lunar New Year, the vessel delays and blank sailings have constricted capacity, which has solidified a floor in the pricing levels. And I have a chart here showing the Freightos, the FBXD, the Freightos Baltic Exchange daily index here, which measures the rates. I think we have that chart. FBXD should be the average rate per 40-foot container, which we're seeing a slight uptick over the last couple of days. We have the IOTI pulled up. Now this is going to be a demand side indicator, and that one's fine to show if we want to go ahead and show that one. Anybody? The rates are going up. Demand has not stopped. Okay, demand is going up, and the rates, or I should say, demand hasn't gone anywhere, and the rates are increasing because, even though they've stabilized in terms of shipping demand, it's at a consistent level, the delays in capacity are creating this additional shortage that's pushing rates a little bit higher. They're up around $16,000 from China to North America's West Coast now.
Interesting. And the thing I love that, of course, if people didn't see the last big FreightWaves virtual event, we're now incorporating some Project 44 data into Sonar. So that was a huge collaboration and a huge release. But some of the P44 data points that Lorianne is using in here, it really speaks volumes into kind of getting into some of the underlying trends that we're seeing when you're looking at some of those ocean activities, because that's one of the areas where people always ask me sometimes about leading indicators. You mentioned, of course, new orders, and then backlogs kind of talk to, hey, here's the runway that we have. But that ocean and that import data really tells you a lot of the times all you need to know in terms of things coming into the country.
Yeah.
Now, when I see on the other side of the equation, I think, hey, things can keep coming into the country all they want. That's great. That's all, fine. But you also need that demand to be there, and you need those consumers to keep buying. So
Right.
at a certain point in time, if there is a lapse in consumer activity or consumption kind of wanes a little bit, it's going to get real interesting in terms of these goods hitting the U.S. Still kind of a lot of delays happening, ships at ports. We're seeing warehouse space at a premium. That could really cause for a lot of chaos.
Yeah, Lorianne closes out her article with some pretty foreboding comments here. How consumers react to the high levels of inflation is one of the biggest wild cards when trying to predict the outlook for the container market. There are some dark timelines ahead, including one in which China feels emboldened to copy Putin's playbook in Taiwan, something that would hit shipping very hard. So don't pull that cork. Your champagne will fall flat when you can actually pour that glass. I mean, I love her writing, so I get a little excited about it. But that is a scary ending to that article. The fact that we have all this uncertainty, and I think that kind of ties into what are we looking at moving forward, Anthony? We talk about pulling forward. All these consistent geopolitical threats that we're seeing right now aren't going away. we're still digging out of COVID. Now we've got Ukraine and Russia, and it's not just directly tied to how Ukraine or Russia imports or exports goods, but also their impact to the supply chains across the globe. So let's talk a little bit about that before we close out the show, about what kind of, active, what's happening with the sanctions.
Yeah.
And what are we going to see? What do we need to expect moving forward?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a great one. Also, I have to give a shout out to Charles A., who had a great comment and some feedback here on LinkedIn, saying, couldn't Russia's economy sustain if Putin decides to only take ruble for Russia's oil or gold on a specific coin, especially if he has more business dealings with China? China has to support Russia, because if they don't, they are more susceptible to sanctions from the U.S. in the future. So I think Charles brings up a great point. And the thing is, when we're looking at China, we mentioned a little bit earlier, they would have to be able to essentially replace all of Europe and all of U.S. Now that U.S. was sending a lot of activity there, but China alone wouldn't be able to just kind of keep Russia's economy afloat. In Putin's war chest, he did have quite a bit of gold, so that is there. But in order to prop up the ruble, China would have to really do a ton of investing in order to kind of even bring that kind of back up.
They would subsequently damage their own economic situation, which China does not look like the type of friend that's willing to do that. And they've made it pretty clear. It's like, we're cool with you just existing, but we're not going to support you overtly.
And on top of that, it seems as though I think some of China's practices right now, knowing that there's not that many buyers for those Russian goods or not that many sellers, they might be a little bit more tougher negotiators now that they're kind of one of the few players left in the game for Russia. So it can expect to potentially see some very creative negotiation from China in order to kind of get the most out of Russia and their kind of vulnerable-ish moment that they've put themselves into. So I think that one's definitely going to be an interesting one to watch. I think mentioned here closely coins. I think cryptocurrency could be a potential play for them as well, but still not going to be enough to prop up the entire
volatility.
Economy. Yeah.
You can't, I don't think a country like Russia could. Well, they got nothing to lose if they continue. So they might as well jump into Bitcoin. If they can afford it, that is, because ain't nobody taking a ruble.
That's another big one is almost kind of getting into somewhat of like a sunk cost fallacy of, familiar with that economic, term of like, yes, it's essentially when you spend so much or you invest so much time or resources into a thing, and because you have done that for so much or so long, you think, hey, I might as well keep going because I've gone this far.
Yep.
Like me and my Facebook stock, for example. But it's just like that, hey, you can stop here. And so because we're seeing so much effort and so much force being put in, you have to see, hey, where are the efforts that are going to be doubled down on? Are we going to see more, hey, we're going to really see these two sovereign nations from Ukraine as a complete, different countries, and that's going to be our double down effort? Or, where's going to be the double down effort that we're going to see from Russia? Because as of now, it seems like, hey, the rest of the world is kind of stepping in here, really showing their cards and getting involved. So there has to be, I think, a definite double down somewhere for Russia, because now you just kind of run back with your tail between your legs potentially.
I don't know if that's going to happen.
Yeah,
in
that doesn't seem to be Putin's way right now.
Yeah, I think the economic sanctions are definitely, I think it just goes to show you, this isn't 1929 anymore.
Yeah.
You can't just go and invade a country and expect your economy to survive. We're all connected on this globe, whether we like it or not. It doesn't matter how much isolation you have.
It doesn't, and you also have to see what the oligarch pressure is going to be put on Putin. If
he's
want
losing money for a lot of his supporters, so we'll see. It's hard for me to kind of visualize this lasting much longer. Well, thank you so much for tuning in, and of course, Anthony, tell the people what they want to hear.
Drink more water, of course. And tune in for more Freight Waves content coming up after this. We'll be live.